I am Mia Allen, and I am 32 years old. 2 days ago, I stood beside my father's casket in Charlotte, North Carolina, listening to my older sister scream for security. "Remove her," Harper shouted, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling of the funeral home. "She is not family." Guests turned in their pews. Cell phones appeared. I had flown 12 hours to say goodbye to my father, and my sister was ordering off-duty police officers to drag me out of the building. My mother, Beatrice, stood right beside her, whispering loud enough for the front row to hear that my presence was upsetting the investors Harper had invited to the service. But I did not move. I looked at Harper and said, "I am not going anywhere." As two officers reached for my arms, the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel swung open. My father's attorney, Gregory Sterling, walked down the center aisle, holding a notarized envelope. He looked at the police and said, "Take your hands off her." Before I tell you what was in that envelope and how it brought down my family-perfect facade, take a moment to like and subscribe to QT Told Stories. Drop a comment letting me know your age and where you are listening from right now. Now let me take you back to the moment the officers stepped away. Harper lost her color. She adjusted her black designer blazer, forcing a fragile smile for her audience. "Gregory," she said, her tone dripping with forced politeness, "you are confused. Mia was cut off years ago. She has no right to be here." Harper had always been the golden child. She ran a luxury lifestyle brand built on constant bailouts and quiet checks from my parents. I was the failure in their eyes because I stopped asking for money at 18. I paid my own way through college, working night shifts to earn my CPA, and built a career as a forensic accountant. They called my job boring desk work. I called it survival. Beatrice touched Harper's arm, scanning the room to gauge the public relations damage. "Gregory," Beatrice said, smoothing her collar, "please do not make a scene. My husband would hate this." Gregory Sterling did not lower his voice. He stood between me and the officers, unfolding the heavy cream paper from the envelope. "Thomas anticipated this exact scenario, Beatrice." He handed me the document. The state seal of North Carolina gleamed at the bottom. Sterling turned to the officers. "You cannot remove her. According to this legally binding directive, Mia Allen is the sole executor of Thomas Allen's estate." He looked directly at Harper, who was gripping the edge of the casket. "Furthermore," he continued, "the deed to this specific burial plot is held by the estate. Mia owns the ground you are standing on. If anyone is trespassing today, it is you." The silence in the room became heavy. The officers exchanged a look, nodded at Sterling, and stepped back into the shadows of the vestibule. Harper stared at me, her chest heaving, the perfect image of the grieving, successful daughter fracturing right in front of her investors. I folded the document and placed it in my pocket. "The service will proceed," I said, my voice steady, "but we are doing it on my terms." The murmur of the congregation swelled as the officers retreated down the aisle. Beatrice recovered first. She smoothed her pearl necklace, adopting the polished, measured tone she reserved for charity galas and country club board meetings. "Gregory," she said, her voice carrying an intentional lightness meant to soothe the room. "You are grieving. We all are. Thomas must have drafted some preliminary paperwork years ago that you forgot to update. Harper is managing the estate. We agreed on this as a family." Sterling did not smile. He did not yield an inch of ground. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the cream-colored paper. "Executed 3 weeks ago," he read aloud, his voice cutting through the tension. "I, Thomas Edward Allen, being of sound mind, hereby revoke all previous wills and codicils. I designate my daughter Mia Allen as the sole executor of my estate, granting her full and exclusive authority over all assets, properties, and final arrangements." Harper looked as though the floor had vanished beneath her. She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. The investors in the third row, the ones Harper had paraded around the lobby 30 minutes earlier, were now leaning forward, whispering behind their printed funeral programs. The pristine image Harper sold online, the devoted daughter managing the tragic loss of her wealthy patriarch, was dissolving in real time. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I turned to the funeral director, a nervous man in a gray suit who had been hovering near the floral arrangements. "Please continue with the schedule," I said. "We are here to honor my father." I took my seat in the front pew. Harper sat 2 feet away, stiff and pale, radiating a silent, suffocating rage. Beatrice sat on her other side, staring straight ahead. For the next hour, I listened to people speak about a man I barely knew in adulthood. The church smelled of lilies and damp wool. The choir sang hymns my father never listened to. Harper eventually stood at the podium to deliver a eulogy filled with hollow buzzwords. She called him her mentor and biggest investor, speaking as if a father was nothing more than a venture capital firm. I remained seated, analyzing the room. Forensic accounting trains you to look past the surface numbers and find the hidden story. The story here was a family pretending they had not spent the last decade bleeding my father dry. Sitting there, I thought about the last time I saw him alone. I was 22, working a double shift during tax season. He had walked into the diner where I waited tables on weekends, ordered black coffee, and slipped an envelope containing $500 under his saucer. "Keep going, Mia," he had whispered, checking the door to make sure no one from Beatrice's social circle saw him. "You have my spine. Do not let them break it." He admired my independence, but he lacked the courage to defend it. My father was a man who commanded boardrooms, but withered under my mother's glare. Beatrice dictated the family narrative. In her version of reality, Harper was the visionary entrepreneur, and I was the ungrateful black sheep who abandoned them. My father paid for Harper's failures to buy peace at home, leaving me to build my life entirely from scratch. I used to resent him for his silence. Today, looking at the polished wood of his casket, I realized his silence was not indifference. It was a holding pattern. He had been waiting for the right moment to hand me the wheel. Following the burial, the reception took place under a white tent on the cemetery lawns. The air felt heavy, typical for a North Carolina afternoon in late spring. Waiters circled with silver trays of hors d'oeuvres. Harper immediately went to work, performing grief for her guests, smiling bravely, pressing dry tissues to dry eyes. I stood near the perimeter holding a cup of water, watching the dynamics shift. People reveal themselves when their established patterns break. Through the crowd, I spotted Harper's husband, Preston. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit and held a scotch glass, but his posture was wrong. His shoulders were rigid. His eyes darted around the tent. Preston usually spent these gatherings bragging about his golf swing or his latest startup venture that never quite launched. He relied on the Allen family name to secure tea times and business loans. Today, he looked like a man standing on a trap door. He grabbed Harper by the elbow, his grip tight enough that she flinched. He pulled her away from a group of sympathetic neighbors, guiding her behind the catering van where they thought no one could see them. They did not notice me standing near the oak tree 20 yards away. I could not hear their words, but their body language screamed. Preston was frantic. He kept running his hand through his hair, pointing toward the funeral home, then back at Harper. His face was flushed. Harper shook her head rapidly, her manicured hands waving in denial. Preston leaned in his face, inches from hers, his expression contorted with genuine terror. His frantic gestures suggested a timeline was collapsing. He was not mourning my father. He was afraid of something else entirely, something the executor designation had just disrupted. A shadow fell across my shoulder. Gregory Sterling stood beside me. He followed my gaze toward Preston and Harper, his expression unreadable. He did not say a word about the argument we were both witnessing. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy brass keyring. "Your father kept his personal affairs separate from the firm," Sterling said quietly. "He maintained a private office on the second floor of the family house, the one your mother turned into a restricted zone years ago." I looked at the keys. Beatrice had declared that room off limits shortly after my father retired. She claimed he needed peace. Now I suspected she just wanted control over the paper trail. "You need to leave this reception," Sterling continued, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "Go to the house right now. Do not tell your mother. Do not tell Harper. Use the side entrance. "Why the rush?" I asked. "The legal probate process takes weeks." Sterling met my eyes. His gaze was sharp and urgent. "Thomas told me he left something in his wall safe, something you would need immediately if he passed unexpectedly. Given your sister's reaction today, I do not believe you have weeks. I am not even sure you have hours." I left the reception without saying goodbye. I walked to my car, a sensible 5-year-old sedan that Harper loved to mock, and pulled onto the highway. The drive to the family estate took 30 minutes. The property sat at the end of a long gated driveway in one of the wealthiest zip codes in Charlotte. Brick facade, manicured lawns, tall hedges designed to keep the world out. I parked at the end of the gravel turnaround, hidden behind a row of crepe myrtles. The property was dead quiet. Everyone was still at the reception. I walked around the perimeter toward the side entrance, holding the brass keys Sterling had given me. My mind raced through the possibilities. What could my father have locked away that required such secrecy? What was Preston so terrified of losing? I reached the stone pathway leading to the side door. I held up the correct key, stepping into the shade of the portico. I never got the chance to use it. The solid oak door was already hanging ajar. Splinters of wood littered the welcome mat. The heavy deadbolt hung loose, its metal housing twisted and torn from the frame. Someone had kicked the door in, and judging by the fresh scuff mark on the white paint, they had done it recently. The air conditioning hummed faintly through the cracked door frame. I could hear the distant drone of a lawnmower from an adjacent estate, contrasting with the eerie silence of my childhood home. I slid my phone out of my pocket, keeping my thumb hovering over the dial pad. I knew I should go back to my car. I knew I should wait for the police. But my father had trusted me with this task, and I refused to let whoever was inside destroy the evidence he had fought to preserve. I pushed the ruined door open and stepped into the dark house. The air inside the foyer felt stagnant and heavy. I stepped over the splintered wood of the side entrance, my shoes making zero sound on the imported Persian rug. The estate possessed that particular stillness of a vacant museum. Growing up, this house was a fortress built on appearances, every room curated to project wealth and stability. Today, it was a crime scene. I walked past the formal dining room. Beatrice kept her antique silver tea sets on open display upon a mahogany sideboard. They sat untouched, catching the late afternoon light filtering through the plantation shutters. My forensic instincts immediately cataloged the anomaly. If this were a standard break-in, the silver would be gone. A desperate thief grabs whatever gleams. They do not walk past thousands of dollars in untraceable silver to venture deeper into a sprawling house. I moved toward the main staircase, trailing my hand along the polished oak banister. My father's private office sat at the end of the second-floor hallway. Beatrice had declared that room a restricted zone shortly after his retirement, claiming he needed unbroken peace to manage his investments. Now, I suspected she just wanted total control over his paper trail. The mahogany door to the study stood wide open. Inside, the room smelled of ozone, burnt metal, and plaster dust. The landscape painting that normally hung behind his heavy desk lay discarded on the carpet, its ornate gilded frame cracked in 3 places. Behind where the painting used to hang, a steel wall safe gaped open. The reinforced door hung at a crooked angle, the locking mechanism drilled out with practiced precision. I stepped closer, crunching on bits of drywall. The interior of the safe was stripped bare. No manila file folders, no backup hard drives, no legal binders, just empty metal shelves covered in a fine layer of gray dust. I checked the glass display case on the opposite wall. My father's vintage Rolex collection remained locked and untouched. The intruder did not want money. The intruder wanted information. I stepped back into the hallway and dialed emergency services. 2 patrol cars arrived within 12 minutes, their sirens cutting through the quiet wealth of the neighborhood. The responding officers were still asking me initial questions in the foyer when the gravel driveway crunched under the tires of a luxury SUV. Beatrice, Harper, and Preston burst through the front entrance. They had abandoned the post-funeral reception the moment word reached them. Beatrice swept into the space, pressing a hand to her chest in a performance of practiced shock. She immediately took control of the narrative, just as she did with every family crisis. "This neighborhood is changing," Beatrice declared to the lead officer, a young deputy who looked thoroughly out of his depth in a house this grand. "There have been petty thefts down the street all year. It must be some desperate teenagers looking for quick cash. You need to increase the patrols around our property immediately." Harper leaned heavily against Preston, burying her face in his shoulder. "This is a living nightmare," she cried, her voice trembling with perfect theatrical pitch. "On the day we bury him, who could do something so cruel to our family?" The deputy offered a sympathetic nod, his pen hovering over his notepad. "It is awful timing, ma'am. We will dust for prints, but these smash and grab crews usually wear gloves. Have you noticed any valuables missing?" Before Beatrice could list her jewelry, I stepped forward. "It was not a smash and grab," I said, keeping my tone level. "The silver downstairs is untouched. The vintage watches in the study are still there. The only thing taken was the contents of the hidden wall safe. The target was financial records." Beatrice shot me a glare sharp enough to cut glass. "Mia is exhausted," she told the deputy, waving a dismissive hand in my direction. "She has been estranged from her father for years and does not know what was kept in that safe. There was likely cash inside." I ignored my mother and watched Preston. He patted Harper's back, playing the role of the protective husband, but his rhythm was off. His breathing was shallow and uneven. He kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes darting toward the staircase leading up to the study. A faint sheen of sweat coated his forehead, despite the robust air conditioning pumping through the estate. I shifted my gaze downward. Preston wore dark navy slacks tailored to a sharp break just above his Italian leather loafers. Right at the hem, stark against the dark wool, was a distinct smudge of pale, chalky powder. Drywall dust. It was the exact same shade as the pulverized plaster scattered across the carpet beneath the blown safe upstairs. The realization clicked into place with cold precision. Preston had left the funeral reception, sped back to the estate, kicked in the side door, and drilled the safe while everyone else was watching Harper deliver her eulogy. He had destroyed the evidence and returned to the cemetery just in time to look panicked. Every instinct honed by years of forensic auditing told me to point at his trousers and demand the police inspect his cuffs. But I held my tongue. An accusation without a paper trail is just family drama, and Beatrice had spent 3 decades mastering that arena. If I accused Preston now, Harper would cry, Beatrice would deflect, and the police would treat it as a civil dispute between grieving relatives. To trap a fraudster, you have to let them believe their cover story worked. You let them relax. You let them think they won. Right up until you close the net. Gregory Sterling arrived just as the crime scene technicians were taping off the study doorway. He bypassed Beatrice and Harper entirely, moving straight toward me. He asked the officers for a brief moment of privacy to confer with the executor of the estate. We stepped into an adjacent guest bedroom, shutting the door behind us. Sterling did not look surprised. He checked the hallway to ensure we were alone, then turned to me with a grim expression. "Thomas knew this would happen," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "He knew exactly who lived in this house, and he knew what they were capable of." The moment his heart stopped beating. Sterling reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek titanium-encrypted hard drive. "He did not keep the real documents in that safe," Mia the lawyer continued, pressing the cold metal into my palm. "He left decoy files in there to keep them occupied. This is the authentic ledger. He entrusted it to my firm 5 months ago with strict instructions to hand it directly to you if the estate was breached." I stared at the drive. My father had lived his final months in a state of quiet paranoia, building a contingency plan he was too afraid to execute while alive. I pulled my work laptop from my tote bag and set it on the guest bed. I plugged the titanium drive into the port. A prompt appeared on the screen, demanding a 12-character alphanumeric decryption key. I did not need to ask Sterling for the password. I knew how my father's mind worked. I typed in the name of the diner where I used to work the night shift, followed by the year I earned my CPA license. The drive unlocked instantly. A sprawling directory of data loaded onto my screen, row after row of financial history, bank statements, and tax filings spanning the last decade. I bypassed the standard checking accounts and opened the primary asset sheet for the family estate. My breath hitched. The numbers staring back at me did not make sense. The sprawling Charlotte estate was supposed to be fully paid off. My father had burned the mortgage papers at a family barbecue 20 years ago, but the ledger showed a staggering 8-figure negative balance tied directly to the property. Someone had taken out a colossal equity loan against the house, draining every drop of stored value the family possessed. The estate was not just broke, it was drowning in toxic debt. I scrolled down to the origination documents, my eyes tracking the sterile black text until I reached the signature line. The loan had not been secured by my father alone. The document required a guarantor, someone to co-sign the catastrophic debt. There, stamped in crisp digital ink right below my father's forged signature, was the name of the co-signer, Harper Allen. I spent the rest of the night locked in my apartment, staring at the illuminated screen of my laptop until my eyes ached. The encrypted ledger Gregory Sterling provided was a labyrinth of wire transfers, offshore dummy corporations, and nested shell accounts designed to confuse a standard auditor. But forensic accounting is not magic. It is simply patience applied to mathematics. Money never vanishes into thin air. It only changes hands. I poured a second cup of black coffee and began tracing the 8-figure equity loan from the primary estate account through a series of local North Carolina banks. I mapped out the dispersal patterns, flagging the recurring transactions that spiked at the end of every fiscal quarter. Within 3 hours, the routing numbers painted a clear, undeniable picture. The funds had been systematically funneled into the corporate operating accounts of Harper's luxury lifestyle brand. Just last month, Harper had graced the cover of a prominent North Carolina business magazine. The glossy spread celebrated her as a self-made entrepreneur, praising her sharp instincts and independent success in the competitive home decor market. The article detailed her upscale storefront in South Park, her exclusive vendor contracts, and her curated image of effortless wealth. Sitting at my kitchen table, I matched the dates of her grand store opening with the dates of the largest wire transfers from my father's stolen equity. Her entire business was a hollow stage set. She was not a self-made visionary. Her luxury brand was bleeding cash, weighed down by unsold inventory and terrible management decisions. She had used my father's retirement to plug a financial black hole, burning through his life savings to maintain her status on social media. The following afternoon, I summoned Harper and Beatrice to Gregory Sterling's law office in downtown Charlotte. The conference room was encased in glass and heavy mahogany, offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. The sterile corporate environment offered no comfort, which was exactly why I chose it. I sat on one side of the long table, with Sterling organizing my printed spreadsheets into neat stacks. Beatrice and Harper arrived 20 minutes late, an old power play they used to establish dominance. Beatrice wore a pristine black morning dress, clutching a tissue she did not need. Harper looked annoyed, tapping her manicured nails against her leather designer handbag as she dropped into the ergonomic chair opposite me. "Thank you for coming," I said, sliding 3 printed copies of the balance sheets across the polished wood. "We need to discuss the insolvency of the estate." Beatrice frowned, refusing to touch the papers. "Insolvency is a dramatic term, Mia. Your father left a substantial portfolio. We are here to talk about proper distribution and planning the charity memorial, not accounting errors." "There are no errors," I replied, keeping my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "The estate is bankrupt. The family house has an 8-figure lien against it." I watched Harper's posture stiffen. She stopped tapping her nails. I pointed to the highlighted rows on the spreadsheets. Someone forged his signature on a catastrophic equity loan and funneled the cash directly into Harper's corporate accounts. Harper snatched the paper from the table. Her face flushed a deep mottled red, the mask of the grieving daughter slipping away. "It was not forged," she snapped, her voice shrill and defensive. "Dad knew my brand was expanding. He wanted to invest in my vision. It was a verbal gift to help scale the company." Sterling leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He fixed Harper with a stare that belonged in a courtroom. A verbal gift does not secure an 8-figure commercial loan, Harper. Furthermore, a verbal gift does not involve a digitally cloned signature taken from a 5-year-old tax return. The metadata proves the document was fabricated. This constitutes severe financial fraud. Beatrice turned pale. Her reaction was not horror at the crime committed against her late husband. It was terror at the prospect of public shame. She looked at the printed numbers, her breathing growing shallow. If the bank forecloses on the house, the country club will know, Beatrice whispered, prioritizing her social standing over the reality of elder abuse. The neighbors will talk. The charity boards will drop me. We will be ruined. Beatrice looked across the table at me, her expression shifting from panic to calculating expectation. She straightened her posture as if preparing to give me an order. Mia, you are a senior auditor. You make a substantial corporate salary. You live in a modest apartment. You have no husband and no children to support. You must take out a loan against your own future earnings to pay off this debt and protect the family name. I stared at my mother, absorbing the sheer scale of her delusion. She did not see a grieving daughter sitting across from her. She saw a resource. She expected me to drain my own hard-earned savings and mortgage my future to subsidize the theft committed by her favored child. She wanted me to pay for the crime, so Harper could continue living a lie. I folded my hands over the ledger. I will not pay a single cent toward this fraud, I said, establishing a hard, unyielding boundary. My salary is my own. I earned it working the night shifts Harper refused to take. I paid for my own education while you funded her vacations. The estate will be liquidated to satisfy the creditors. The house will be sold. You cannot sell the family home, Beatrice gasped, clutching her pearls as if I had struck her. Where am I supposed to live? You should ask Harper, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. She took the equity. Perhaps you can live in the back room of one of her luxury storefronts. Harper shoved her chair back, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the floor. You have always been jealous of me, Harper hissed, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. You could never stand the fact that Dad believed in my potential, while you sat in a gray cubicle crunching numbers. You think this piece of paper gives you power over me? You will regret this. I will make sure everyone knows exactly who you really are. She turned on her heel and stormed out of the conference room. Beatrice hurried after her, casting one final venomous glare in my direction. The heavy glass door swung shut, leaving a tense silence in its wake. Sterling exhaled, gathering the documents into his leather briefcase. They are desperate, Mia. Desperate people make careless mistakes, but they also lash out. Keep your guard up. I left the law office feeling a strange sense of clarity. The truth was finally documented on paper, stripping away the decades of gaslighting I had endured. I drove back to my apartment exhausted but focused, formulating a plan to engage the forensic auditing board the next day. I needed to lock down the routing numbers before Preston could move the cash again. I went to sleep that night with my phone on silent, expecting a quiet morning to prepare for the legal storm ahead. The storm arrived before sunrise. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing relentlessly against the nightstand. The screen was flooded with notifications. Text messages from cousins I had not spoken to in years. Alerts from old high school acquaintances. Missed calls from the managing partners at my accounting firm. I unlocked the screen and opened the primary social media platform. Harper had posted a lengthy, tearful video. She sat in her pristine living room, wearing a simple gray sweater, performing the role of a devastated victim with terrifying skill. In the video, Harper looked directly into the camera and unleashed a masterclass in manipulation. She claimed I was a financially abusive, estranged sister who had swooped in during our father's final, vulnerable days. She told her hundreds of thousands of followers that I had manipulated a dying man with severe cognitive decline into signing away the family estate out of pure, bitter jealousy. She claimed I was currently trying to evict our grieving mother and destroy the small business Harper had built from scratch. The Post already had 50,000 shares. The comments section was a toxic wasteland of strangers demanding I be investigated, fired, and arrested. Harper had weaponized her online audience, framing me as a monster to camouflage her own crimes. The digital smear campaign had begun, and she was aiming directly at my livelihood. The notification chime on my phone became a steady, rhythmic drill. By 8 in the morning, my inbox overflowed with vitriol. Extended family members across North Carolina, people who had not called me in a decade, suddenly found the time to send paragraphs of outrage. My Aunt Linda texted that I was a disgrace to the Allen name. A cousin I barely knew left a voicemail calling me a vulture. Harper had weaponized her following, but Beatrice provided the ammunition. I logged into a secondary social media account and found a public comment from my mother pinned to the top of Harper's video. Beatrice wrote a polished, tragic paragraph claiming I had always struggled with reality. She told her country club friends and our relatives that I was mentally unwell, framing my legal authority as a paranoid delusion. She cast herself as the heartbroken matriarch trying to protect a disturbed daughter from herself. I set the phone face down on the kitchen counter. I did not shed a tear. Forensic auditing teaches you that noise is just a distraction from the data. Let them talk. I had work to do. I dressed in a tailored navy suit and drove to my accounting firm in uptown Charlotte. The morning traffic crawled along Independence Boulevard, giving me time to mentally organize my tasks for the day. I planned to pull the commercial banking records and trace the exact IP addresses used for the wire transfers. Those plans dissolved the moment I stepped off the elevator onto the 14th floor. My managing partner David stood waiting by the reception desk. His expression was rigid. He did not offer his usual morning greeting. He gestured silently toward his glass-walled office at the end of the corridor. 2 other senior partners were already seated inside, their hands folded over a thick manila folder. "Sit down, Mia," David said, closing the door and shutting the blinds. I took the empty chair, my pulse keeping a slow, steady rhythm. The folder on the desk bore a red urgent stamp. Human Resources received an anonymous ethics complaint early this morning. David began refusing to meet my eyes. The filing includes fabricated ledger sheets and detailed allegations claiming you have been siphoning funds from 3 of our highest net worth clients. I looked at the folder. Harper and Preston were escalating. They knew they could not beat me in a probate court, so they decided to cripple my resources. "The numbers in that complaint are fake," I said, keeping my voice level. "You know my audit history. You know my client retention rate. Someone is filing a retaliatory grievance because I just uncovered an 8-figure fraud inside my own family estate." "I believe you," David replied, his tone laced with corporate cowardice. "But the firm has protocols. A formal complaint involving client capital triggers an automatic suspension. We are placing you on administrative leave effective immediately, pending an internal investigation. We need your security badge and your company laptop." They were stripping away my access to professional software, my income, and my daily routine. A lesser person might have crumbled in that leather chair. But my family underestimated the very trait they spent years mocking. I unclipped my security badge and placed it on the desk next to the company laptop. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer. "Conduct your investigation, David. You will find 0 discrepancies in my accounts. Call me when you finish." I walked out of the building into the humid Charlotte air. My sister thought taking my job would break my spirit. She failed to realize she had just gifted me 40 free hours a week to hunt her down. I drove back to my apartment and opened the decrypted titanium hard drive Gregory Sterling had provided. During my grueling CPA exams, I learned a crucial survival skill. I learned how to sever emotion from mathematics. While my peers panicked over failing grades and sleep deprivation, I trained my brain to view every problem as a simple equation needing a solution. Panic consumes energy. Detachment provides clarity. My family was a chaotic equation, and I was going to balance the ledger. I isolated the routing numbers from the fraudulent equity loan. The originating institution was a boutique regional bank with a branch located in South Park, less than 10 miles from Harper's flagship store. A bank does not issue an 8-figure commercial loan without rigorous identity verification. Someone had to sign the physical paperwork. Someone had to bypass the underwriters. I printed the loan origination packet from my encrypted files, slid the pages into a leather portfolio, and drove to South Park. The bank branch smelled of citrus cleaner and stale coffee. High vaulted ceilings and polished marble floors gave the space an illusion of untouchable security. I bypassed the teller line and walked directly to the receptionist guarding the executive suites. I presented the notarized executor designation bearing the state seal. "I need to see the branch manager," I said. "Now." 10 minutes later, I sat across from a man named Arthur, a mid-level executive wearing a suit that cost more than my first car. He reviewed the executor document, his polite customer service smile faltering as he read the fine print. "How can I help the estate today, Miss Allen?" Arthur asked, shifting uncomfortably in his plush chair. I opened my portfolio and slid the printed loan origination packet across his desk. "I need you to explain how your underwriters approved this catastrophic equity line against a property owned by a man who never set foot in this branch." Arthur swallowed hard. His eyes darted to the signature line. "Mr. Allen signed the documents," he stammered. "We have the digital authorization right here. It was processed through our secure portal." I pulled a second piece of paper from my portfolio and laid it next to the loan packet. It was a copy of my father's tax return from 4 years ago. I pointed a pen at the signature on the tax return, then moved the tip to the signature on the loan document. "Look at the loop on the letter T," I instructed, my voice sharp and commanding. "Look at the trailing ink on the letter N. They are identical down to the microscopic pixel. No human being signs their name with mathematical exactness twice in a lifetime. This signature was lifted from a digital PDF and pasted onto your loan agreement. Your bank authorized wire transfers based on a crude digital forgery." Arthur stared at the two documents. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray. The polished executive facade cracked, revealing a terrified middle manager realizing his career was about to end in a federal indictment. This loan was flagged for manual review. I pressed, leaning over the desk to trap him in my gaze. A forged digital signature means someone walked into this building, bypassed the standard fraud protocols, and convinced you to release the funds. Who sat in that chair and handed you the routing numbers for Harper Allen's corporate account? "We followed standard procedure," Arthur protested, his voice raising an octave. His hands began to shake, rattling the expensive pen resting on his desk blotter. "Standard procedure requires visual verification for loans exceeding $5 million. I countered, reciting the federal banking regulations from memory. "If you do not give me a name right now, my next stop is the State Banking Commission. I will file a formal inquiry, and they will freeze every asset in this branch while they audit your entire department. Who facilitated the wire transfers?" Arthur shrank back against the leather upholstery. Sweat beaded along his hairline. He looked at the closed blinds of his office window as if expecting the police to arrive at any second. "I never saw your father," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling. "I only dealt with the designated courier. We had a signed letter of authorization on file." I did not break eye contact. "Who was the courier, Arthur?" The manager wiped his forehead with a shaking hand. He swallowed again, his Adam apple bobbing nervously. "It was the son-in-law," Arthur confessed, his voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "Preston. Preston handled all the physical paperwork. He delivered the final routing instructions in person." I leaned back in my chair, the pieces of the puzzle snapping into perfect, devastating alignment. Harper was the face of the fraud, but Preston was the architect. The drive from South Park back to my apartment complex gave my pulse time to settle into a steady, calculated rhythm. The late afternoon sun dipped below the Carolina pines, casting long, fractured shadows across the asphalt parking lot. I pulled my sedan into my designated space, the engine clicking as it cooled. The air hung thick with humidity, a stifling blanket that made the sudden chill running down my spine feel entirely out of place. I gathered my leather portfolio, the one containing the forged loan documents, and stepped out of the vehicle. A dark, polished SUV sat idling 3 spaces down. The tinted windows obscured the driver, but the vehicle reeked of unearned privilege. As I locked my doors, the engine cut off. The driver's side door opened. Preston stepped onto the pavement. He wore the same custom-tailored navy slacks from the funeral, the ones that had carried the drywall dust from my father's looted safe. But the manicured, supportive husband routine was gone. The man walking toward me lacked the polished veneer he usually presented at country club mixers. His jaw was clenched, his posture rigid and coiled. He moved with a predatory silence, blocking the pathway to my building staircase. "Hello, Mia," Preston said, his voice dropping, the charming southern drawl he used on investors. "We need to have a conversation." I stopped walking, keeping a measured distance between us. My grip tightened on the portfolio, but I kept my facial expression void of any reaction. "We have nothing to discuss, Preston, unless you want to explain how your loafers ended up coated in plaster from a drilled lockbox." He did not flinch at the accusation. Instead, a cold, calculating smirk touched the corners of his mouth. He stepped closer, attempting to use his physical height to cast a shadow over me. "You always were too smart for your own good," he murmured, slipping his hands into his pockets. "But being smart does not mean you understand how the world actually works. You are playing a dangerous game, pulling bank records and terrorizing middle managers." I met his gaze without blinking. "I am not playing anything. I am executing an estate. You committed wire fraud." Preston let out a dry, humorless laugh. He leaned against the concrete pillar of the stairwell, projecting an aura of false confidence. "Let us drop the righteous indignation. We both know your sister is a sinking ship. Harper's brand is hemorrhaging capital. She spends money faster than it prints, and she is too blind to see the writing on the wall. I stepped in to secure our future. I did what Thomas should have done years ago." He was rewriting history, framing his theft as a noble rescue mission. But Preston was a parasite. He had floated through life on the coattails of my family name, launching a series of tech startups that collapsed within months, always leaving someone else holding the bag. Now he was trying to leave my deceased father holding this one. "I am offering you a pragmatic solution." Preston continued, his tone shifting into the cadence of a boardroom negotiation. "A mutually beneficial exit strategy. You seal the audit, you declare the estate insolvent due to bad market investments, sign off on the paperwork, and walk away. In exchange, I will personally wire 40% of the disputed funds back into a private trust under your name. Tax-free, untraceable." He was trying to buy my silence. I analyzed the offer, letting the numbers tumble through my mind. Why 40%? If the loan was intact, he could offer half. If it was gone, he could offer nothing. The math painted a vivid, damning picture. "If you refuse," Preston added, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "that little ethics complaint at your firm becomes a much larger problem. Right now, it is an internal human resources issue, but I have the drafted paperwork ready to submit to the National Licensing Board. I will tie you up in regulatory hearings for the next decade. You will lose your CPA license. You will never audit a lemon stand, let alone a corporate account. I will bury your career so deep you will forget what a balance sheet looks like." The threat hung in the humid air, designed to paralyze me. Instead, it provided the final piece of the puzzle. "You are not offering me Harper's money," I said, the realization crystallizing with cold clarity. "You are offering me your cut." Preston's smirk faltered. A muscle feathered along his jawline. "Harper thinks all the stolen equity is propping up her lifestyle brand." I continued stepping toward him, refusing to yield the physical space. "She thinks you are the loyal husband managing her corporate accounts. But a luxury store does not burn through an 8-figure injection in a matter of months. The inventory does not match the deficit. You are siphoning the cash out the back door. You are transferring the equity into offshore accounts before her company files for bankruptcy. You are stealing from your own wife." "Shut up," Preston hissed, glancing around the empty parking lot, his polished facade cracking to reveal genuine panic. "You only offered me 40% because the other 60% is already bouncing through international shell companies." I pressed, delivering the facts with rhythmic precision. "You want me to close the audit because if I keep digging, Harper will realize you are abandoning her to take the fall. You are planning to flee the moment the creditors come knocking." "Take the deal, Mia," he warned, taking a step toward me, his hands balling into fists. "You cannot win this. I have the leverage." I looked at his clenched fists and felt a profound sense of pity for the coward standing before me. "You do not understand how an executor designation works, Preston. You think you can intimidate me into hiding the paper trail, but you are too late." His eyes darted back and forth. "What does that mean?" "It means I did not just visit the bank today to ask polite questions," I explained, my voice sharp and final. "Before I left Gregory Sterling's office yesterday, I signed a stack of legal subpoenas. The estate formally requested the unredacted routing numbers for every wire transfer associated with that fraudulent equity loan. The compliance department at the bank is legally obligated to comply. The records are already locked, sealed, and en route to my attorney's firm. I do not need your 40%. I am going to recover every single cent, and I am going to hand your offshore routing data directly to the federal authorities." The color drained from Preston's face, leaving him looking like a hollow shell of a man. The false confidence evaporated, replaced by raw, unadulterated fear. He realized his blackmail attempt had just backfired spectacularly. He had confessed to the embezzlement, offered a bribe, and threatened a licensed accountant, all while the trap had already snapped shut around his ankles. "You are making a terrible mistake," he stammered, backing away toward his idling SUV. "You are destroying this family." "This family destroyed itself," I replied. "I am just balancing the books." Preston practically sprinted to his vehicle. He yanked the driver door open, threw the engine into gear, and slammed his foot on the accelerator. The tires squealed against the asphalt, leaving thick black streaks as he sped out of the parking lot, blowing past the stop sign at the exit. He was running out of time, and he knew it. I watched his taillights disappear into the evening traffic, exhaling a long, steady breath. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a sharp, focused determination. I had the architect of the fraud on the run. Now I needed to prepare for the inevitable fallout. I turned and walked up the 3 flights of concrete stairs to my apartment. The hallway smelled faintly of pine cleaner and stale dinner cooking from the neighboring units. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and dropped my keys onto the entryway table. I reached into my mailbox, pulling out a stack of generic circulars and utility bills. Tucked between a grocery flyer and a credit card offer was a thick manila envelope bearing a certified legal seal. My pulse quickened. The return address belonged to a high-powered litigation firm located in the most expensive district of Charlotte. I tore the flap open, pulling out a stack of dense, stapled legal documents. The header read, "In the General Court of Justice, Superior Court Division." I scanned the opening paragraphs of the archaic legal jargon, failing to mask the sheer hostility of the filing. Harper had not spent the day crying over her failing business. She had hired a shark. The document was an emergency court injunction filed just hours ago. She was petitioning a judge to have me legally stripped of my executor status, claiming I was mentally unfit, deeply compromised, and acting with malicious intent against the surviving heirs. She requested a hearing within 48 hours to freeze my authority and seize the estate assets back into her control. They were trying to rip the wheel from my hands before I could drive them off the cliff. The real war was about to begin inside a courtroom. I sat across from Gregory Sterling the next morning with the dense stack of legal documents resting between us on his mahogany desk. The injunction Harper filed was a masterpiece of malicious fiction. She had retained Donovan Reed, a litigator infamous across Charlotte for turning civil disputes into public character assassinations. Reed did not bother arguing financial code. He destroyed reputations. The filing contained a web of strategic lies designed to unseat me before I could present a single ledger to a judge. Reed had attached the fabricated ethics complaint from my accounting firm as Exhibit A. Exhibit B was a sworn affidavit from Beatrice. In her statement, my mother asserted that my father spent his final months suffering from severe cognitive decline. She claimed I had manipulated a vulnerable dying man into signing over the estate out of deep-seated resentment toward my successful sister. Beatrice was fighting for her social survival. For decades, Harper served as her passport to the elite tiers of local high society. When Harper launched her luxury brand, Beatrice leveraged that superficial glamour to secure chairmanships on hospital galas and country club committees. Harper provided the glossy aesthetic, and Beatrice bathed in the reflected prestige. My life offered them zero social currency. A forensic accountant who worked late nights and lived in a standard apartment was a disappointment to a woman whose entire identity relied on public envy. I remembered my college graduation. Beatrice spent the entire dinner talking about Harper's upcoming vacation to Europe, ignoring my degree entirely. Beatrice was willing to commit perjury now to protect the illusion Harper built, because if the luxury brand collapsed, Beatrice lost her audience. Sterling rubbed his temples, staring at the injunction. "Reed knows exactly what he is doing," the attorney murmured, tapping his pen against the legal pad. "He is going to present this ethics suspension to the judge and frame you as a rogue, embittered daughter trying to hijack the estate to cover your own corporate embezzlement. He will use your mother's tears to paint you as a predator." The routing numbers prove Preston and Harper stole the equity I countered, keeping my voice void of the frustration building in my chest. We have the bank manager's verbal confession. We have the metadata on the forged signature. The money trail is undeniable. Sterling shook his head, leaning back in his leather chair. Family court operates on a different frequency than a criminal tribunal, Mia. In a contested estate hearing, judges in Mecklenburg County default to the surviving widow. It is an unwritten rule of the bench. If Beatrice takes the stand, sheds a few practiced tears, and claims you are terrorizing her during her period of grief, the judge will freeze your authority. They will appoint a neutral third-party receiver, which will tie up the assets for months, maybe years. By the time we prove the fraud in a separate venue, Preston will have moved the money through a dozen offshore accounts. The cash will vanish, and the bank will foreclose on the house. I absorbed the cold reality of his assessment. Spreadsheets and metadata were not enough to combat a weeping widow in front of a sympathetic judge. Forensic accounting relies on logic, but a courtroom responds to narrative. I needed something visceral to break their story apart. I needed undeniable proof that my father was lucid, aware, and acting of his own free will when he drafted that executor designation. I pulled my laptop from my tote bag and opened my father's personal calendar, cross-referencing the dates from the decrypted ledger. I needed to retrace his final 3 weeks of life. I scanned the digital entries looking for any deviation from his routine. His schedule was sparse, mostly filled with estate planning meetings with Sterling and quiet afternoons at the property. But one recurring appointment caught my attention. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he visited a private medical clinic on the outskirts of the city. The payments were drawn from a secondary checking account, hiding the transactions from Beatrice. The physician listed was Dr. Elias Thorne. I ran a quick search on the medical registry. Thorne was not an oncologist or a cardiologist. He was a premier neurologist. I left Sterling's office and drove straight to the clinic. The facility sat tucked behind a row of ancient oak trees, projecting an atmosphere of discreet, expensive care. The waiting room smelled of sterile wipes and herbal tea. I approached the reception desk, presenting my executor credentials alongside my state identification. The receptionist, a stern woman in a pristine uniform, studied the state seal before picking up her phone. 10 minutes later, a nurse escorted me down a quiet hallway and into a windowless examination room. Dr. Thorne entered a moment later, closing the door behind him with a soft click. He was an older man with tired, observant eyes and a starched white coat. He glanced at the executor document resting on the examination table, then looked directly at me. "You are Mia," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a distinct firmness. "Thomas spoke of you often during our sessions. He said you were the only person in his house who dealt in facts." "I need the facts about my father's cognitive state during his final month," I replied, maintaining a professional posture. "My family is attempting to void his legal directives by claiming he suffered from dementia. They filed a court injunction this morning, arguing he lacked the mental capacity to appoint me as his executor." Dr. Thorne let out a slow, heavy sigh, crossing the room to a locked filing cabinet in the corner. "Your father did not have dementia, Mia. He had a failing heart, but his mind was sharp until the moment it stopped. He knew your mother and sister would try this exact maneuver. He spent his last few appointments discussing how to preempt their strategy. He knew Beatrice would lie under oath to protect Harper's lifestyle." Thorne retrieved a small brass key from his pocket and unlocked the bottom drawer of the cabinet. He pulled out a heavy, fireproof metal lockbox. He walked back across the linoleum floor and placed the box on the examination table between us. 2 days before he passed, Thomas came into my office. Thorne explained, resting his hand flat against the cool metal lid. "He brought this box. He instructed me to hold it and to hand it over only to you in person if you came looking for proof. He said you would know when the time was right to use it." I thanked the doctor, declining his offer of a bag, and carried the heavy lockbox out of the clinic. The midday Carolina sun beat down on the asphalt parking lot, but I felt a sudden, sharp chill of anticipation. I unlocked my sedan and set the box on the passenger seat, the metal casing secured with a simple 3-digit combination lock. I sat behind the steering wheel staring at the dials. I did not need to guess the numbers. I spun the first dial to the month of my birth, the second to the day, and the third to the year I passed my accounting boards. The latch clicked open with a crisp, metallic snap. I lifted the heavy lid, unsure of what physical evidence my father could have gathered. The interior of the box contained no legal documents. There were no printed bank statements or hidden cash. Resting on a bed of dark foam was a single silver USB drive. Attached to the sleek metal drive was a white adhesive label bearing my father's distinct, meticulous handwriting. It read, "For Mia, when they try it." The Mecklenburg County Courthouse operated with a sterile and unyielding efficiency. I sat beside Gregory Sterling at the heavy oak defense table, keeping my posture straight and my hands folded over a blank legal pad. The air conditioning hummed a low, continuous drone that chilled the skin. Across the wide center aisle, Harper and Preston sat, with Beatrice and their litigator, Donovan Reed. Harper wore a conservative black dress, her hair pulled back to project an image of exhausted mourning. Preston kept his eyes fixed on the judge's empty bench, his jaw tight. Beatrice held a lace handkerchief, already practicing her expressions of maternal sorrow. They looked like the perfect grieving family, a flawless portrait engineered for a sympathetic audience. Judge Patricia Caldwell entered the courtroom, taking her seat with a weary sigh that suggested she had heard 1,000 bitter family disputes. She called the emergency hearing to order, and Donovan Reed immediately took the floor. Reed possessed a predatory charisma. He paced the carpeted area in front of the bench, speaking with a resonant baritone designed to command attention. He painted a vivid, fabricated picture of my life. He described me as a bitter, estranged daughter who had spent a decade harboring deep resentment toward her successful older sister. He claimed I swooped into my father's life during his final vulnerable weeks to hijack his estate out of pure spite. Reed then approached the bench and submitted a thick dossier. He informed the judge that my accounting firm had just placed me on administrative leave due to a severe ethics complaint involving missing client capital. He wove a narrative connecting the two events, suggesting I was desperate for cash to cover my corporate embezzlement, and thus manipulated my dying father into giving me total control of his assets. It was a brilliant, devastating story. If I were an outside observer, I might have believed him. Reed called Beatrice to the witness stand to cement the illusion. My mother walked the short distance with frail, measured steps. She took the oath, resting her hand on the Bible, and sat down. Reed began his questioning with gentle, coaxing prompts. Beatrice answered in a trembling voice. She testified that my father had suffered a rapid and terrifying cognitive decline over his last 6 months. She looked at the judge with tear-filled eyes, claiming Thomas frequently forgot his own address and could not recognize his grandchildren. She stated under penalty of perjury that I isolated him in his private study, badgering a confused old man until he signed the executor designation just to make me stop. I watched my mother lie to a Superior Court judge without a single hesitation. Growing up, Beatrice always smoothed over Harper's academic failures by blaming the teachers, weaving elaborate excuses to shield her favored child from reality. Now she was utilizing that same talent to shield Harper from federal prison, willing to destroy my freedom to maintain her social standing. I did not glare at her. I did not shake my head. I sat perfectly still. Gregory Sterling wrote a few sparse notes on his legal pad, but he did not object to a single question. We were executing a perjury trap. In forensic auditing, when you suspect a client is maintaining a fraudulent ledger, you do not interrupt them while they are entering the fake numbers. You let them build the entire spreadsheet. You let them sign their name to the bottom line, certifying the lies as fact. Only then do you present the actual receipts. Beatrice and Reed were stacking their liabilities high into the air. When Reed finished his direct examination, he looked at us with a triumphant smirk, confident he had secured the injunction. Judge Caldwell turned her attention to our table, her expression tight, with apparent distaste for my supposed actions. She asked Sterling if he wished to cross-examine the witness. Sterling stood, buttoning his suit jacket. He declined the cross-examination. A murmur rippled through the gallery where a few junior clerks sat watching the proceedings. Reed looked momentarily confused. Sterling walked toward the center podium. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm and level, "the defense calls no witnesses. We have only one exhibit to submit into evidence. It will address every claim made by opposing counsel and the witness today." Sterling retrieved the silver USB drive from his pocket. He requested permission to connect his laptop to the courtroom audio-visual system. Judge Caldwell granted the request, watching with narrowed, curious eyes. Harper shifted in her chair, her gaze dropping to the silver flash drive. Preston touched his collar, his breathing accelerating. They had anticipated a shouting match, a bitter exchange of accusations, or a desperate plea for fairness. They did not anticipate digital media. Sterling plugged the drive into his laptop and mirrored the display to the large flat-screen monitor mounted on the courtroom wall. The screen flickered to life. The video quality was pristine. My father sat in the center of the frame, resting in a leather chair inside Dr. Elias Thorne's examination room. The stark clinical lighting highlighted the pale, drawn lines of his face, showing the physical toll of his failing heart. But his eyes were clear, focused, and unblinking. "My name is Thomas Edward Allen," my father stated, his voice resonating through the courtroom speakers. "Today is October 14th. He held up a copy of a major national newspaper, displaying the front page date to the camera. "I am recording this statement in the presence of my neurologist, Dr. Elias Thorne, who has just completed a comprehensive cognitive evaluation." The camera panned briefly to show Dr. Thorne standing near the door, nodding in confirmation, before panning back to my father. "I am of sound mind," my father continued, staring directly into the lens. "I possess total clarity regarding my assets, my family, and my final wishes. I am making this recording because I know my wife Beatrice and my daughter Harper will attempt to invalidate my legal directives the moment I pass away. They will claim I am senile. They will claim I was coerced. Every word they speak to that effect will be a calculated lie." The silence in the courtroom turned absolute. Beatrice froze on the witness stand, her tearful expression melting into a mask of pure terror. Donovan Reed dropped his pen, the metallic clatter echoing loudly across the hardwood floor. Harper gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table so hard her knuckles turned white. My father leaned forward in his chair on the screen. "Let the record reflect that I have designated my daughter Mia Allen as the sole executor of my estate." I did this not out of coercion, but out of necessity. She is the only person in my bloodline who operates with integrity. She is the only one I trust to uncover the damage they have done." He paused, taking a slow, labored breath, gathering his strength for the final, devastating blow. "I am fully aware that my son-in-law, Preston, acting under the direction of my daughter, Harper, forged my signature to secure an 8-figure equity loan against my property. I know they funneled that money into Harper's failing retail business. I stayed silent while I was alive because I lacked the courage to endure the conflict in my own home. But I refuse to let them steal Mia's future. Mia, if you are playing this video in a courtroom, it means they tried to ruin you to hide their theft. Do not let them walk away. Strip them down to the studs. Take everything." The video ended, the screen fading to a stark, blinding black. The echo of my father's final command lingered in the cold air. Judge Caldwell stared at the blank monitor, her jaw set into a rigid line. She turned her gaze slowly toward the plaintiff's table, her eyes locking onto Preston, who was now sweating through his custom-tailored suit, realizing he had just been implicated in federal fraud by a voice from the grave. The trap had snapped shut. The silence shattered. It did not break with shouts or dramatic weeping. It broke with the sharp, panicked scraping of wooden chairs against the polished floor. Preston shoved his seat backwards, standing up, as if preparing to bolt for the heavy double doors at the back of the room. Harper remained frozen, her manicured hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her knuckles turned pale white. She stared at the blank monitor, unable to comprehend that her airtight scheme had just evaporated into thin air. On the witness stand, Beatrice looked like a fragile porcelain doll that had just cracked down the center. Her practiced tears dried up instantly. They were replaced by a hollow, terrified realization that she had just committed felony perjury on the public record with the Superior Court judge sitting 3 feet away. Donovan Reed did not attempt to comfort his clients. The high-priced litigator stood rigid, his face flushing a deep crimson. A lawyer of his stature guarded his reputation fiercely, and his clients had just tricked him into presenting a forged narrative. He packed his legal briefs into his briefcase with swift, furious motions, signaling his immediate exit from the sinking ship. Your Honor, Reed stated, his baritone voice lacking its prior smooth confidence. Counsel requests an immediate recess. Furthermore, I will be filing a motion to withdraw as representation for the plaintiffs, effective today. I was not made aware of the fraudulent nature of these allegations. Judge Patricia Caldwell did not grant the recess. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the elevated bench, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. She surveyed the plaintiff's table with visible disgust. "You do not need a recess," Mr. Reed Caldwell declared, her tone cutting through the tension like a steel blade. "You need a criminal defense attorney for your soon-to-be former clients. I have sat on this bench for 15 years. I have rarely witnessed such a brazen, calculated attempt to defraud an estate and mislead a court of law." Caldwell turned her attention to Gregory Sterling, who stood quietly beside me. "The hostile injunction is denied in its entirety," she ruled, striking her gavel with a sharp, decisive crack. Mia Allen retains full and unencumbered authority as the sole executor of the Thomas Allen estate. She shifted her fierce gaze back to Preston, who was now sweating through his expensive collar. Furthermore, based on the evidentiary testimony provided by the deceased, I am issuing an immediate emergency freeze on all personal and business assets tied to Preston and Harper Allen. This includes the operating accounts for the retail brand, all joint checking portfolios, and any domestic holding companies. Harper let out a strangled gasp. "You cannot do that," she cried out, abandoning her composed facade. "I have payroll. I have exclusive vendors. My store will go bankrupt by Friday." "Your store is a crime scene," Caldwell countered, her voice devoid of any sympathy. "I am also forwarding a full transcript of today's proceedings along with this digital exhibit directly to the district attorney. This court strongly recommends opening a formal investigation into wire fraud, elder exploitation, and perjury. We are adjourned." Sterling packed his laptop into his leather satchel. He gave me a brief, approving nod. The legal machinery was now in motion, and it would grind them down without mercy. I gathered my forensic ledgers and walked away from the defense table. I did not look at my sister or my brother-in-law as I passed them. They were no longer untouchable threats. They were simply targets waiting for indictments. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the sprawling marble corridor of the courthouse. The air outside the courtroom felt cooler, yet a profound sadness settled deep into my chest. Growing up, I viewed my father as a passive bystander, a man who retreated into his private study while Beatrice and Harper tore my self-esteem apart. I built my career in forensic accounting specifically to rely on numbers, because numbers never lied, whereas my family lied constantly. My father lacked the courage to protect me while he breathed, but he spent his final agonizing months engineering a flawless trap from his deathbed. His silent suffering bought my vindication. My quiet reflection shattered the moment the courtroom doors swung open again. Mia. The voice echoed sharply down the marble corridor. Beatrice marched toward me, her heels clicking a frantic, erratic rhythm against the floor. Her designer morning dress looked wrinkled. Her perfectly coiffed hair had fallen out of place. Without her elite social audience, she morphed into a desperate, furious woman, losing her grip on reality. "You destroyed this family," Beatrice hissed, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You planned this trap. You humiliated your sister in front of a judge. You just signed a death warrant for her business. We are going to be on the front page of the local news, and it is your fault." I stopped walking. I turned to face my mother, feeling my pulse slow into a calm, steady beat. For 30 years, I absorbed her criticism. Today, I was closing the account forever. "I did not destroy anything," I replied, my voice echoing cold and hollow in the empty hallway. "I simply provided the receipts. You and Harper destroyed this family the moment you decided my father's life savings were a slush fund for her vanity project." Beatrice shook her head, clinging desperately to her delusions. "Harper is a visionary. She just needed capital to scale her brand. Preston was only trying to help her succeed. You could have managed this quietly, Mia. We could have resolved this privately, like a civilized family." "A civilized family does not forge a dying man's signature," I stated, stepping closer, forcing Beatrice to look me in the eyes. "And a mother who actually loves her children does not commit perjury to protect a thief. You spent your entire life enabling Harper's entitlement because her fake success earned you invitations to country club dinners. You traded your integrity for a social calendar. Now the check is due, and you are bankrupt." Beatrice opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. She looked at me, realizing for the first time that the quiet daughter she cast aside had evolved into an adversary she could not manipulate. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The truth required no volume to inflict maximum damage. I turned my back on her and walked toward the bank of elevators. Beatrice did not follow. She stood alone in the vast, echoing corridor, a woman who had just realized her prized social status was about to be replaced by a criminal subpoena. I pressed the call button for the elevator, letting out a long, ragged exhale. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the hearing began to recede. I needed to get back to my apartment, connect to my secure servers, and begin drafting the recovery frameworks for the stolen equity. As the elevator doors slid open, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was not a text message or a standard email. It was a high-priority encrypted alert from the financial tracking software I had installed on my secure network. I pulled the device out and unlocked the screen. The forensic monitoring system I set up to watch the routing numbers was flashing red. The court order Judge Caldwell just issued froze the domestic bank accounts instantly. But the international wire system operates on a slight delay, requiring secondary authorization across different time zones. The gap between a local judge's gavel and a global banking freeze is narrow, but it exists. Someone was exploiting that gap. I read the scrolling data lines, my stomach twisting into a tight knot. Preston was not waiting around the courthouse to be arrested. He was actively logging into his offshore dummy corporations from a remote IP address. The stolen equity, tens of millions of dollars my father had spent a lifetime building, was currently in motion. Preston was initiating a cascading series of transfers. He was attempting to drain the Caribbean shell accounts and move the cash into untraceable cryptocurrency ledgers before the federal freeze hit the global network. The trap in the courtroom had worked, but the architect of the fraud was making one final desperate sprint for the exit. The race to save the money had just begun. I did not wait for the elevator to reach the ground floor before dialing Gregory Sterling. The cellular reception in the courthouse lobby was weak, but his voice came through crisp and alert. I told him Preston was actively initiating wire transfers. Sterling instructed me to bypass my apartment and meet him directly at his law firm, where we could use his secure corporate network to interface with the banking authorities. I sprinted across the concrete parking deck, threw my leather tote into the passenger seat of my sedan, and navigated the dense afternoon traffic of downtown Charlotte. The sun began to dip behind the high-rise buildings, casting long shadows across the pavement. Inside the law firm, the atmosphere shifted from standard legal practice to a digital war room. Sterling had already cleared a large glass conference table and set up 2 secondary monitors. I connected my laptop, bypassing the standard firewalls, and logged into my forensic tracking software. The software provided a real-time visualization of the routing numbers associated with my father's stolen equity. The domestic accounts were frozen solid by Judge Caldwell's emergency order. Preston knew this. He was not trying to touch the local retail accounts. He was targeting the offshore holding companies he had set up in the Cayman Islands. He was trying to push the funds through a decentralized cryptocurrency exchange, aiming to tumble the digital assets until they became untraceable. The global banking system relies on the SWIFT network to verify international transfers. That verification requires a brief window of latency, a bureaucratic pause that allows institutions to confirm the origin of the funds. Preston was exploiting that exact window, initiating dozens of microtransactions designed to slip under the automated fraud thresholds. I began writing a series of heuristic algorithms to flag his IP address and trace the destination wallets. My fingers moved across the keyboard in a rapid, continuous rhythm. Sterling sat beside me, drafting the international freeze orders that we would need to present to the federal authorities to halt the offshore movement. As I watched the data scroll across the glowing monitor, a sharp memory surfaced. During Thanksgiving dinners, Harper used to perform mock yawns whenever relatives asked about my career. She called my profession boring desk work. She would laugh and tell her friends that I spent my life staring at gray spreadsheets while she built a glamorous empire. Beatrice always chimed in, suggesting I take a marketing course to learn how to interact with real people. They viewed my forensic training as a social defect. They preferred the illusion of effortless wealth over the gritty reality of earned competence. Now the irony hung heavy in the silent conference room. That boring desk work was the only thing standing between their survival and total financial ruin. My ability to read the hidden language of ledgers was actively dismantling the fraudulent empire Harper had spent a decade building. I typed a new command into the terminal, isolating the geographic location of the device Preston was using to initiate the transfers. He was not hiding in his luxury home in South Park. The IP address pinged from a cellular network moving rapidly down Interstate 85. I cross-referenced the data with the active credit cards tied to his personal name. A recent charge appeared for a premium rental vehicle originating near the Charlotte city limits. Preston was on the highway. He was heading south toward Atlanta, driving straight toward the busiest international airport in the country. The realization crystallized with chilling clarity. Preston was not transferring the offshore funds to save Harper's retail brand. He was not trying to protect his wife. He was abandoning her. He planned to drain the remaining stolen equity, convert it into untraceable digital currency, and board an international flight alone. Harper was currently sitting in her sprawling house, waiting for her husband to fix a legal crisis, unaware that he was leaving her to take the entire fall. I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen. a profound moral choice presented itself. I could close my laptop right now. I could let the algorithms fail and allow Preston to vanish into the Caribbean. If he disappeared, Harper would face the full wrath of the federal government alone. She would be indicted for the forged signatures and the wire fraud. The sister who mocked me, who tried to steal my inheritance, and who launched a vicious smear campaign against my name would absorb the maximum punishment. Getting rid of Preston meant letting Harper burn. It was a clean, effortless exit. But forensic accounting demands precision. It requires holding every single variable accountable for its position on the ledger. Letting the primary architect of the theft escape was bad math. I wanted Preston to answer for the crime he engineered. I chose total accountability. I packaged the IP logs, the digital wire trails, and the offshore routing protocols into a single encrypted digital dossier. Sterling signed the attached legal affidavit certifying the evidence under the authority of the executor designation. I bypassed the local police department entirely. White-collar flight requires a federal response. I drafted a direct brief and forwarded the entire package to the Cybercrimes Division of the FBI field office in Charlotte. The transmission sent with a soft electronic chime. We had given the federal authorities the exact coordinates of his rental car, his destination, and his digital wallets. Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, removing his reading glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. The sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows had turned a deep, inky black. We had been tracking the numbers for 6 hours. The office was deserted, the only light coming from the glow of our monitors. "You stopped him," Mia Sterling said, his voice thick with exhaustion. "The Bureau has the freeze orders. They will flag his passport the moment he steps near a departure gate. It is over." I closed my laptop, the adrenaline finally leaving my system, replaced by a deep, aching fatigue in my joints. I thanked the attorney, packed my equipment into my tote bag, and walked out into the empty hallway. I drove back to my apartment complex in a daze, the city streets flashing past in a blur of neon lights and quiet intersections. I wanted nothing more than a glass of water and 12 hours of uninterrupted sleep. I unlocked my apartment door and tossed my keys onto the counter. Before I could even take off my blazer, my phone began to vibrate in my pocket. The caller identification displayed Harper's name. I stared at the screen. Harper had not called me directly in 4 years. Our entire relationship consisted of passive-aggressive text messages and family group chats filtered through our mother. I almost let the call go to voicemail, assuming she wanted to scream at me for the courtroom disaster earlier that afternoon. I pressed the accept button and raised the phone to my ear. I did not hear the polished, arrogant voice of a luxury brand CEO. I heard a ragged, guttural sob. The sound was raw and pathetic, stripping away every layer of the golden child persona she had cultivated her entire life. Mia Harper choked out her voice, trembling so violently I could barely understand the words. I stood frozen in the center of my dark kitchen. "What is it, Harper?" "He took it all," she sobbed, the panic radiating through the digital connection. "Preston is gone. I logged into our personal joint checking accounts to pay the emergency retainer for a new lawyer. The accounts are zeroed out. My savings are gone. My credit cards are declining. He drained everything we had." I listened to her world collapse, feeling a strange absence of pity. "He's heading to Atlanta," I informed her, my tone flat and factual. "He was trying to take the offshore money too, but I froze the transfers an hour ago. He left you to take the charges for the forged equity loan." A long, agonizing silence stretched over the line, punctuated only by Harper's ragged breathing as the reality of her husband's betrayal sank in. She had built her life on appearances, and the facade had just crushed her. "Mia, please," Harper begged, her voice shrinking into the fearful tone of a lost child. "You have to help me. You have to tell them I did not know about the forgery." "Tell who?" I asked. "There is a loud pounding noise on my front door," Harper whispered, dissolving into a fresh wave of hysterical tears. "There are dark vehicles parked in my driveway. Men in windbreakers are standing on my porch with flashlights. The federal agents are here, Mia. They are asking for me by name. What do I do?" The pounding on the other end of the line echoed through the small speaker of my phone. The sound was sharp, rhythmic, and demanding the universal cadence of federal law enforcement executing a late-night warrant. Harper was weeping so hard her breaths hitched into jagged gasps. The polished, untouchable CEO of a luxury lifestyle brand had vanished, replaced by a terrified woman realizing the consequences of her actions had finally arrived at her front door. "Mia, what do I do?" Harper pleaded, her voice cracking under the weight of sheer panic. "They are going to break the door down. I do not have a lawyer. Preston took all the cash. Please, just tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them Dad wanted me to have the money." I stood in the center of my dark kitchen, listening to my sister beg for a rescue I would never provide. My entire life, Beatrice and Thomas had rushed in to fix Harper's mistakes. They paid off her credit cards, smoothed over her academic failures, and funded her vanity projects. Harper had never faced a single repercussion. She expected the family safety net to deploy, assuming I would simply step into our parents' role and shield her from the fallout. "I am not going to lie to federal agents, Harper," I said, keeping my tone clinical and detached. "You need to walk downstairs and open the door before they take a battering ram to the frame. When they ask you questions, invoke your right to legal counsel and remain silent. Do not try to charm them. Do not try to spin a narrative. Just hand over your electronics and cooperate." "But I am scared," she sobbed, the sound pathetic and raw. "I know," I replied, "but you are out of options. Open the door." I ended the call, cutting off the sound of the agents shouting their final warning. I placed my phone on the counter and walked to the window, staring out at the glowing skyline of Charlotte. The digital ledgers were balanced. The fraud was exposed. The machinery of justice was now in motion, and it would not stop until the debt was paid. The next morning, the local news cycle caught fire. Harper's face was plastered across the early broadcasts and digital media outlets. The headlines detailed the late-night raid on her sprawling South Park estate and the subsequent seizure of her retail storefront. The journalist painted a grim picture of a collapsing empire built on alleged wire fraud and elder exploitation. The glossy illusion she spent a decade cultivating shattered overnight. I drove to Gregory Sterling's law firm at 9 o'clock. The receptionist directed me straight to the main conference room. When I opened the heavy glass door, the distinct scent of stale coffee and raw anxiety hit me. Beatrice and Harper were already seated at the mahogany table. The transformation was striking. Beatrice wore a plain gray blouse, her usual immaculate makeup smeared and uneven. Her posture, normally rigid with social superiority, had crumpled. Beside her, Harper looked like a ghost. She wore the same wrinkled sweatpants she presumably slept in. Her eyes were swollen and bloodshot, her hands trembling as she clutched a paper cup. The golden child was gone, leaving only the wreckage of a massive, unearned ego. Sterling sat at the head of the table, organizing a stack of preliminary injunctions. He nodded at me as I took the seat opposite my mother and sister. "Mia, thank God you are here," Beatrice began, her voice frantic, laced with the familiar cadence of emotional manipulation. "This entire situation has spiraled out of control. The media is twisting everything. Harper spent the entire night being interrogated. She is a victim here. Preston manipulated her. We need to focus on protecting her from these ridiculous federal charges." I opened my leather portfolio and pulled out the clean balance sheets. "Preston did not force her to forge a signature," I stated, laying the documentation on the table. "Harper is a willing participant in the theft. The federal prosecutors have the routing numbers, the metadata, and Dad's sworn video testimony. This is not a misunderstanding. It is a felony." Beatrice slammed her hand against the polished wood, the sudden noise echoing in the quiet room. "She is your sister," Beatrice shouted, tears streaming down her face. "Family protects family. You have the power to fix this. Sterling told us the estate still holds a significant amount of untouched liquid trust money, the original, clean capital your father saved before Preston took the equity loan." I looked at Sterling, who remained impassive. "Yes," I confirmed. "The primary trust accounts remain intact." Then you need to authorize a wire transfer this morning, Beatrice demanded, her tone shifting from a plea to an order. We found a top-tier criminal defense firm in Raleigh. Their retainer is staggering, but they specialize in white-collar federal defense. They can keep Harper out of prison. You need to use the trust money to hire them. I stared at my mother, absorbing the sheer audacity of her request. She wanted me to use my father's legitimate, hard-earned savings to hire a legal team to defend the daughter who helped steal his equity. The emotional manipulation was profound. She was trying to weaponize my sense of duty, assuming my fundamental decency would override my logic. I folded my hands, resting them on the table. The untouched trust money is designated for a local North Carolina scholarship fund, I explained, my voice steady and unyielding. That was Thomas' philanthropic wish. He wanted to help independent students pay for their education. He did not want his life savings converted into a legal defense fund for wire fraud. I am not authorizing the transfer. Mia, please. Beatrice wept, burying her face in her hands. You cannot send your own sister to prison. Your father would never want this. My father explicitly asked me to hold her accountable. On a video recording played in open court yesterday, I corrected, refusing to let her twist his legacy. I will not subsidize the consequences of her actions. Harper sat frozen, staring at the grain of the mahogany table. The safety net she had relied on her entire life was officially gone. The realization seemed to drain the remaining defiance from her posture. She looked up, meeting my gaze. Her eyes were hollow, stripped of the arrogant disdain she usually directed at me. I forced her to sit in the discomfort. I did not speak. I did not offer a comforting platitude. I let the silence stretch until the weight of her own reality crushed the last of her pride. You were always better than me, Harper whispered, the words slipping out in a raspy, defeated breath. Beatrice lifted her head, looking at Harper in confusion. Do not say that, sweetheart. It is true, Harper continued, ignoring our mother, keeping her eyes locked on mine. Every time you passed an exam, every time you earned a promotion, you proved that you did not need them. You built a real life. My entire brand was just a fragile stage set. I hated watching you succeed because your genuine competence was a mirror. It reflected exactly what I lacked. She let out a bitter, humorless laugh, wiping a tear from her cheek. I had to steal just to pretend I was on your level. I wanted to be the successful daughter so badly, I was willing to bankrupt my own father to maintain the illusion. And now, I have nothing. Preston took the remaining cash and ran. I am a fraud, Mia. I always was. The admission hung in the air heavy and undeniable. For years, I had craved that exact confession. I thought hearing her admit her jealousy would feel like a victory. Instead, it just felt tragic. The toxic rivalry that defined our youth was built on her deep-seated imposter syndrome, enabled by a mother who valued aesthetics over character. Before I could respond, the heavy glass door of the conference room swung open. A junior paralegal stepped inside, looking flushed and urgent. He handed a folded slip of paper directly to Gregory Sterling. Sterling read the note, his expression tightening. He looked up, his gaze shifting from Harper to me. The federal authorities just contacted my office, Sterling announced, his voice carrying a stark finality. They executed the arrest warrant. Preston did not make it to his departure gate. Agents intercepted him at the security checkpoint inside the Atlanta airport an hour ago. He is currently in federal custody, awaiting extradition back to North Carolina. Harper closed her eyes, letting her head fall forward until it rested against the polished wood of the table. A quiet sob racked her shoulders. Beatrice stared blankly at the wall, the last remnants of her high society illusion evaporating into the sterile corporate air. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling a long, slow breath. The chase was over. Preston was locked in a holding cell. Harper was facing a federal indictment she could not buy her way out of. The conflict had escalated beyond the confines of a bitter family dispute. It was now a full-scale federal prosecution bound by rigid legal statutes and mandatory sentencing guidelines. I packed my spreadsheets back into my leather portfolio and stood up. I no longer had to manage the fallout personally. The justice system would handle the rest. I turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving the golden child and the enabling matriarch to face the cold, unyielding reality of their own design. 2 weeks after the federal raid, the landscape of my family had shifted into a stark, unrecognizable reality. Preston sat inside a concrete federal holding facility, denied bail by a magistrate who deemed him a severe flight risk. Harper surrendered her passport and wore a bulky GPS monitor around her ankle, navigating the terms of a restrictive pretrial release. The luxury brand entered receivership, its remaining inventory auctioned off to cover a fraction of the outstanding commercial debt. The golden child was now a high-profile defendant represented by an overworked public defender. The fraud was contained, but Beatrice refused to accept the finality of her defeat. Without the sprawling Charlotte estate, my mother lost her identity. The brick facade, the manicured hedges, and the prestigious zip code were the only things tethering her to the elite social circles she prized above all else. Stripped of her wealth, she faced the terrifying prospect of becoming ordinary. Desperation breeds reckless strategy. I discovered the extent of her denial on a Tuesday evening when a process server knocked on my apartment door. He handed me a thick manila envelope bearing the seal of the civil court. I opened the document at my kitchen table. Beatrice had filed a nuisance lawsuit against me. She retained a bargain-tier attorney named Leonard Briggs, a man who operated a high-volume practice out of a strip mall in a neighboring county. Briggs specialized in generating paperwork designed to harass opponents into submission. The legal theory presented in the filing was a chaotic amalgamation of spousal elective share statutes and squatter privileges. Beatrice claimed that her prolonged residence in the estate granted her an irrevocable right to remain on the premises. She was attempting to bypass the airtight executor designation and the forged equity debt she had helped conceal. The lawsuit held zero legal merit. Any competent judge would eventually dismiss the claims. But Beatrice and Briggs were not aiming for a courtroom victory. They were utilizing a tactic known as legal attrition. They intended to file endless discovery requests, procedural delays, and frivolous motions to drag the dispute out for years. Beatrice knew I earned a standard corporate salary. She calculated that the exorbitant hourly fees required to defend myself in civil court would eventually drain my personal checking account. She assumed I would surrender the estate simply to stop the financial bleeding. I reviewed the summons with Gregory Sterling the following morning. He confirmed my analysis, warning me that extracting Beatrice through the standard eviction process while fighting a civil suit could take 18 months. "We are not playing a protracted game of civil procedure," I informed Sterling, setting the summons on his desk. "My mother expects an emotional battle. She wants to wear me down. We will handle this with corporate efficiency. Schedule a mandatory mediation session for tomorrow afternoon. Tell Briggs that if they do not attend, we will bypass civil court and involve the district attorney." The final mediation took place in a secondary conference room at the law firm, a sterile space, devoid of the plush leather and mahogany found in the primary executive suites. I wanted the environment to reflect the cold reality of the transaction. Beatrice arrived wearing a vintage designer suit, a deliberate attempt to project her former dominance. Leonard Briggs followed close behind, clutching a faux leather briefcase. Briggs looked eager, projecting the false bravado of a low-tier lawyer hoping to secure a quick, lucrative settlement from a wealthy estate. Beatrice refused to look at me. She stared out the window at the city skyline, adopting the posture of a wronged matriarch enduring a temporary indignity. Briggs opened the discussion with a rambling, rehearsed monologue. He spoke about marital devotion, the sanctity of the family home, and the supposed cruelty of displacing a grieving widow. He demanded the immediate transfer of the estate deed to Beatrice, along with the dismissal of all pending eviction notices. I let him talk until his momentum faded into an awkward silence. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage with his theatrical pleas. I simply slid 2 slim, identical black folders across the polished table. "You misunderstand the leverage in this room, Mr. Briggs," I said, maintaining a steady, unyielding tone. "The estate you are trying to claim is technically insolvent due to an 8-figure forged equity loan, a loan your client actively concealed while committing perjury in a superior court hearing." Briggs shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing at Beatrice. She had clearly omitted the perjury detail during their initial consultation. I tapped the first black folder. "Option A is a prolonged legal battle. If we leave this room without an agreement, I will execute the formal eviction notice tomorrow morning. Law enforcement will remove Beatrice from the property. I will file a counterclaim for frivolous litigation, attaching a permanent lien to any future income she generates. Most importantly, I will forward the official transcript of her sworn testimony from last week's injunction hearing directly to the federal prosecutors handling her son-in-law's wire fraud case. Lying under oath to facilitate a financial crime carries a mandatory minimum prison sentence." The color drained from the face of my mother. Her rigid posture collapsed. The illusion of control she carried into the room shattered against the unforgiving edge of documented facts. I moved my hand to the second black folder. Option B is a structured settlement. The estate retains a subsidiary trust account originally designated for philanthropic purposes. I am willing to authorize a modest, highly restricted monthly stipend drawn from the interest of that account. The funds will cover the rent on a standard 2-bedroom condo in a quiet suburb outside the city limits. It will cover basic utilities and groceries. It will not cover country club dues. It will not cover luxury vehicles. I opened the folder revealing the printed contract. "The stipend comes with a strict morality clause," I continued. "You will sign over all claims to the Charlotte estate. You will withdraw this frivolous lawsuit with prejudice. You will cease all contact with me. If you make a single disparaging public remark about my father, my career, or the administration of this estate, the funding terminates permanently. You will be left with nothing." Beatrice stared at the contract, her breathing shallow and uneven. She looked at Leonard Briggs, silently pleading for a legal loophole, a hidden strategy to reclaim her power. Briggs read the terms of the agreement. He was a nuisance lawyer, not a criminal defense attorney. The threat of a federal perjury investigation terrified him. He closed his briefcase with a definitive click. "Take the deal," Beatrice Briggs advised, his voice devoid of his earlier bravado. "You have no case. If she hands that transcript to the district attorney, I cannot help you." Beatrice looked back at me. Her eyes searched my face for a trace of hesitation, a flicker of the obedient daughter she used to command. She found only the detached precision of an auditor closing a bankrupt account. The realization settled over her like a heavy shroud. She had no social audience to manipulate. She had no golden child to weaponize. She had no money to shield her from the consequences of her choices. "You are so cold, Mia," Beatrice whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her defeat. "I learned from the best," I replied, sliding a pen across the table. Beatrice picked up the pen. Her hand shook so severely that she could barely grip the plastic barrel. She pressed the tip to the signature line, leaving a jagged, uneven trail of ink across the bottom of the page. The matriarch who spent 3 decades ruling our family through intimidation and superficial charm was finally dismantled. She was not defeated by a screaming match or a dramatic confrontation. She was defeated by paperwork. I collected the signed agreement and placed it back into my portfolio. The toxic hierarchy that defined my childhood was officially eradicated. But the professional damage Harper engineered remained unresolved. I had neutralized my family, but I still needed to reclaim my career. The ethics board at my accounting firm was waiting. The ink dried on Beatrice's settlement agreement, signaling the end of a toxic lineage. I packed the signed documents into my leather portfolio and walked out of Gregory Sterling's office. The Charlotte skyline loomed in the distance, bathed in the pale light of an overcast afternoon. I had neutralized the threats in my personal life, My mother was exiled to a modest condo. My sister wore an ankle monitor waiting for a federal trial. My brother-in-law sat in a concrete holding cell. But the victory remained incomplete. The accounting firm still held my professional license in purgatory. Harper's fabricated grievance remained active on their servers, a lingering poison designed to ruin the only thing I built for myself. Growing up, the family estate functioned as a theater, where Harper played the leading role. I existed merely as background scenery. When I turned 18, the financial spigot shut off for me, though it continued pouring for her. I spent my early 20s navigating a grueling schedule. I worked night shifts, processing payroll for a logistics company, using the quiet hours between 2 and 5 in the morning to study for my CPA exams. The fluorescent lights of that cramped office flickered constantly, casting long shadows over my textbooks. I paid for every exam module in cash, skipping meals to afford the registration fees. I did not possess a safety net. I possessed grit. I assembled my career brick by brick, understanding that competence was the only currency no one could steal. Harper tried to steal it anyway. Now I intended to make her fail one last time. I returned to my apartment and compiled a comprehensive defense dossier. I did not rely on emotional appeals or character references. I gathered the certified transcripts from Judge Patricia Caldwell's courtroom. I printed the federal indictment records detailing Preston's wire fraud and Harper's complicity. I placed the digital video file of my father's sworn testimony onto a secure flash drive. The physical weight of the evidence felt substantial in my hands. It was the undeniable proof of my integrity forged in the fires of a family breakdown. The following morning, I walked into the lobby of my accounting firm wearing my sharpest tailored suit. The receptionist glanced at me with a mixture of surprise and discomfort, aware of my suspended status. I requested immediate access to the executive boardroom. 10 minutes later, I sat at the head of a long glass table. My managing partner, David, sat opposite me, flanked by 3 senior members of the ethics committee. Their expressions mirrored the sterile, unforgiving environment. They expected a desperate plea for leniency. They expected a disgraced auditor begging to save her license. David adjusted his tie, clearing his throat. "Mia," he began, his tone formal and guarded, "we agreed to this meeting because of your prior history with the firm, but the allegations in the human resources file are severe. Embezzling client capital is a career-ending offense. We need to hear a compelling explanation." I did not offer an explanation. I offered a prosecution. I slid the thick bound dossier across the glass table. "The grievance filed against me is a retaliatory fabrication," I stated, my voice echoing with steady precision. The anonymous tip originated from my sister, Harper Allen. She submitted those forged ledger sheets the morning after I discovered she and her husband embezzled an 8-figure equity loan from our late father's estate. David frowned, opening the dossier. The senior partners leaned in their skepticism, shifting into quiet curiosity. I directed their attention to the first tab. You will find a certified transcript from the Mecklenburg County Superior Court dated earlier this week. The presiding judge dismissed an injunction against me and issued an emergency freeze on all assets belonging to the accuser. I pointed to the second tab. Next, you will see the federal arrest warrants executed by the Cybercrimes Division of the FBI. My brother-in-law was intercepted at an international airport, attempting to launder the stolen capital through offshore accounts. I provided the tracking algorithms that allowed law enforcement to halt the transfers. Finally, I placed the flash drive on the table. This contains a sworn, recorded testimony from my father, executed in the presence of a medical professional, naming Harper and Preston as the architects of the theft and designating me as the sole executor tasked with holding them accountable. The ethics board sat in stunned silence. The rustle of turning pages filled the room as they absorbed the magnitude of the documentation. They scrutinized the federal seals, the judicial signatures, and the stark reality of the indictments. They realized I had not simply avoided a professional scandal, I had engineered a high-stakes, multi-jurisdictional takedown of a sophisticated financial crime ring, all while navigating the death of my father. David closed the folder. The rigid corporate posturing drained from his posture. He looked at me, his eyes wide, with a newfound reverence. The firm trains auditors to locate missing decimal points, but I had just demonstrated an investigative lethality they rarely encountered outside of specialized government agencies. Mia David said, his voice quiet, stripped of its earlier authority. This is extraordinary. We had no idea you were managing a crisis of this scale. The complaint is obviously baseless. We will expunge the grievance from your record immediately. You are fully cleared to return to your accounts. One of the senior committee members, an older woman known for her ruthless standards, leaned forward. Returning to your standard account seems inadequate, she noted, her gaze fixed on me with sharp approval. The forensic tracking you executed on those offshore dummy corporations is brilliant work. The firm is currently expanding our elite fraud division. We need leadership that does not flinch under extreme pressure. David nodded in rapid agreement. We would like to formally offer you a promotion to Senior Partner of Forensic Auditing, he proposed. It comes with a substantial equity stake in the firm and total autonomy over the investigative department. I sat back in my chair, absorbing the profound irony of the moment. Harper filed that fake complaint to destroy my livelihood. She wanted to humiliate me, to strip away the one thing I built independently. Instead, her sabotage provided the exact stage I needed to showcase my unmatched competence to the executive board. Her attempt to ruin my career served as the catalyst for my highest professional elevation. I accept the position, I replied, allowing a brief, genuine smile to touch my lips. Have the new contracts drafted by Friday. I left the corporate high-rise feeling a profound, resonating peace. The battles were fought and won. The only remaining task was closure. I drove to the sprawling Charlotte estate one final time. The property felt different now. The toxic energy that used to suffocate the rooms had evaporated, replaced by a hollow, echoing stillness. I needed to prepare the house for the market. The estate sale liquidators were scheduled to arrive the next morning to inventory the antique furniture, the silver tea sets, and the curated art pieces Beatrice left behind. I walked upstairs to my father's private study. The room remained exactly as the crime scene technicians left it. The drilled wall safe gaped open like a metallic wound. Plaster dust coated the baseboards. I began sorting through the remaining items on the heavy mahogany desk, placing pens and loose stationery into a cardboard box. I moved to the towering bookshelves lining the far wall. My father collected vintage legal thrillers and historical biographies, displaying them in pristine alphabetical rows. I ran my fingers along the worn leather spines, feeling a sudden pang of grief for the man who lived in the shadows of his own home. As I reached the bottom shelf, my hand brushed against a thick, hardbound edition of a classic tax code encyclopedia. The spine felt unusually rigid. The book sat slightly out of alignment with the rest of the row, a subtle anomaly that triggered my auditor's instinct. I pulled the volume from the shelf. It felt incredibly light for a textbook of its size. I opened the front cover. The pages were glued together. The center of the book had been meticulously hollowed out, forming a hidden, rectangular compartment. Resting inside the concealed space was a single, sealed envelope. I set the hollowed book onto the desk. My pulse quickened as I examined the envelope. The paper was thick and cream-colored, bearing the distinct, jagged handwriting of my father. It did not contain legal jargon or financial directives. The front of the envelope held only 2 words, written with a shaky but determined hand. For Mia. I broke the seal, unaware that the contents of this hidden letter would shift the entire foundation of everything I thought I knew. I slid my finger under the flap of the envelope, breaking the wax seal. The paper felt heavy textured, carrying the faint scent of the cedar desk where it had been hidden. I unfolded the single sheet. The handwriting was unmistakably my father's. The letters slanted slightly to the right, written with the black fountain pen he always kept in his breast pocket. I took a slow breath, letting the silence of the empty study settle around me, and began to read. My dearest Mia, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means you found the decoy safe, bypassed the false ledgers, and dismantled the illusions governing this family. I always knew you would. You possess a brilliant, unforgiving mind. You see the world exactly as it is, without the need for comfortable lies. I am writing this to apologize. I owe you a debt I can never repay. I traced the edge of the paper, the words anchoring me to the floor. For 30 years, Thomas wrote, I chose the path of least resistance. Your mother demanded a flawless public image. She thrived on social currency, and Harper was her chosen instrument. I watched them tear down your confidence. I watched them demand your resources. I watched them isolate you. I saw everything, Mia. I stayed silent because I was a coward. I valued a quiet house over a righteous one. I funded Harper's endless failures because arguing with Beatrice felt like stepping into a hurricane. I let them cast you out, hoping you would somehow survive on your own. The ink smeared slightly on the next paragraph as if the writer had paused, his hand trembling. You did more than survive. You became a force of nature. I watched you pay your own way through college. I monitored your career from a distance, tracking your promotions and your CPA certifications. You built a pristine, independent life. You never asked me for a dime. Every time I looked at you, I felt a profound sense of awe, followed immediately by a crushing wave of shame. My inaction forced you to become unbreakable. I lowered the letter, my vision blurring. The stoic, detached posture I maintained for weeks began to fracture. I learned about the forged equity loan 6 months ago, the letter continued. I confronted Preston in this very study. He threatened to expose my failing health to the board of directors and ruin our remaining stock options. He told me Beatrice would back his story. I realized then that my passivity had bred a monster. They were going to drain the estate, leave me to die in a bankrupt house, and leave you to sort through the ashes. I knew if I fought them while I was alive, Beatrice would tie me up in competency hearings until my heart gave out. So I called Gregory Sterling. I could not be your shield in life, Mia. So I decided to be your sword in death. We spent my final months engineering the trap. We locked the real ledgers. We recorded the sworn testimony. We drafted the executor designation, ensuring no one could contest your authority. I did not leave you this estate so you could save your mother and sister. I left you the keys so you could lock them out. You are the only person strong enough to burn this toxicity to the ground. Do not pity them. Do not rescue them. Finish the audit. I love you, Mia. I am so incredibly proud to be your father. I read the final sentence 3 times. I love you. I am proud to be your father. The dam holding back decades of suppressed emotion finally gave way. I did not cry out of grief for a lost relationship. The man who wrote this letter was a stranger to me for most of my life. I wept out of sheer, overwhelming relief. I was mourning the child who spent years wondering why she was never enough for her own family. I was releasing the immense, suffocating pressure of being the outcast. The tears fell onto the mahogany desk, hot and rapid. For the first time in 32 years, I felt entirely seen. My father recognized my struggle. He validated my intellect. He used his dying breaths to hand me the ultimate vindication. The crying was jagged and cathartic, washing away the residual bitterness that had hardened in my chest. When I finally wiped my face, the air in the study felt lighter. The oppressive weight of the Allen family legacy had vanished. I folded the letter, tucked it into my breast pocket, and walked out of the house. I never stepped foot inside that property again. The subsequent weeks moved with a swift corporate efficiency. The estate liquidators arrived the following morning. They inventoried the antique furniture, the silver tea services, and the curated art collections. Every item Beatrice prized for its social status was tagged, cataloged, and sold at a public auction. The proceeds went directly into the primary trust account. The real estate closing occurred 20 days later. I sat in a neutral boardroom at a title company reviewing the final purchase agreements. A young, affluent couple bought the house, eager to remodel the interior and erase the dark history hidden within the walls. I signed the transfer deeds without a single hesitation. The millions of dollars generated from the sale cleared the remaining valid debts of the estate. The physical anchor of our family dysfunction was officially liquidated, converted into clean, trackable capital. Meanwhile, the federal justice system processed Harper with a rigid lack of sympathy. Her high-profile status evaporated the moment the grand jury returned the indictments. She faced a mountain of unassailable evidence: the routed IP addresses, the forged digital signatures, and the offshore cryptocurrency wallets painted an undeniable portrait of wire fraud. Her overworked public defender advised her to avoid a jury trial. Harper accepted a plea agreement. The prosecutors dropped the maximum conspiracy charges in exchange for her full cooperation against Preston, who remained the primary architect of the international money laundering scheme. Harper's sentencing hearing was a brief, sterile affair. The federal judge ordered her to pay immense financial restitution. She received 5 years of supervised probation, bound by strict travel restrictions and mandatory community service. The terms of her release required her to maintain steady, verifiable employment to garnish her wages for the restitution payments. The former CEO of a celebrated luxury lifestyle brand was forced to enter the standard job market with a felony conviction on her record. No corporate entity would hire a convicted fraudster. Harper eventually secured employment at a discount retail chain on the outskirts of Charlotte. She worked the evening shift, folding synthetic sweaters and organizing clearance racks for minimum wage. The woman who built her identity on elite social exclusivity now spent her nights wearing a polyester uniform, answering to a teenage shift manager. The irony was poetic. The universe has a profound way of enforcing humility when you refuse to learn it yourself. Preston faced a much darker horizon. The federal prosecutors piled on charges for international flight bank fraud and identity theft. He was transferred to a high-security facility awaiting a trial that promised a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. His offshore accounts were seized, the funds repatriated by the global banking authorities. He gambled his freedom on a flawed equation, and the house always wins. I sat at my own desk in my newly upgraded corner office at the accounting firm. The view from the window showcased the sprawling Charlotte skyline, a vast grid of glass and steel reflecting the late morning sun. My promotion to senior partner of forensic auditing was finalized. My career was secure. My reputation was immaculate. I opened my leather portfolio and retrieved a stack of certified cashier checks. They represented the final liquidated assets of the Thomas Allen estate. The forged equity loan was officially expunged by the Banking Commission. The original untouched trust capital was ready for dispersal. I clicked my pen and signed my name on the bottom line of the first check. The ink flowed smooth and steady. I did not feel a trace of anger. I did not feel a lingering sense of resentment toward Beatrice or Harper. I felt a deep, unshakable sense of peace. The ledger was balanced. The accounts were closed. The story of my toxic family was over, and I was holding the pen that wrote the final chapter. I placed the stack of certified cashier checks onto the polished surface of my desk. The sunlight caught the embossed seals, reflecting the final tangible value of the Thomas Allen estate. I did not deposit the funds into my personal accounts. I did not need my father's money to secure my future. My career provided all the stability I required. I wanted to honor the man who wrote that hidden letter, the man who admired resilience but lacked the courage to practice it. I arranged a meeting with the financial aid directors at the largest state university in North Carolina. Sitting in their administrative boardroom, I established the Thomas Allen Endowment. The legal charter contained specific, unyielding criteria. The funds were not designated for legacy admissions or students padding their resumes with elite extracurriculars. The scholarship was reserved exclusively for independent undergraduates. It targeted the students working 40 hours a week, taking night classes, and paying their own tuition in cash. I structured the grants to cover textbooks, certification fees, and living expenses for young women striving to build careers in accounting and finance. I wanted to build a bridge for the students who lacked a family safety net. I wanted to reward the grit my mother and sister spent a lifetime mocking. Signing those endowment papers felt like planting a tree in scorched earth. A new foundation was taking root, nourished by the truth. With the financial dispersal concluded, I enforced the final phase of my exit strategy. I executed a permanent, non-negotiable boundary. I routed Beatrice's monthly stipend through an independent third-party trust administrator. The legal contract stipulated that the administrator would handle all communication regarding her housing and utility payments. My mother no longer possessed my direct phone number. She no longer had my email address. When she attempted to send a handwritten letter to my corporate office 2 months later, presumably to complain about the modest size of her condo, I handed the unopened envelope to my secretary and instructed her to return it to the sender. I severed all ties with Harper. I did not track her probation hearings. I did not search for her name in the local news. The justice system was monitoring her retail wages and collecting the mandatory restitution. She was living the stark reality of her own choices. Society often dictates that family bonds require unconditional tolerance. People will tell you that blood obligates you to endure endless disrespect. They push the narrative of the grand reunion, insisting that holding firm boundaries is a sign of bitterness. They demand you sit at the holiday table with the same people who tried to destroy your livelihood, simply to maintain a comfortable illusion for the rest of the room. I reject that premise entirely. I did not offer my mother and sister a dramatic reconciliation. I did not extend a forced forgiveness designed to ease their guilt. Forgiveness requires genuine accountability, a trait neither of them ever demonstrated. They only regretted getting caught. Giving them access to my life again would only provide them with new opportunities to undermine my peace. I chose the quiet, clean reality of consequences. My daily routine now consisted of morning coffee on my balcony, challenging investigative work at my firm, and weekends spent exploring the Carolina mountains. The ambient anxiety that used to hum in the background of my life, the constant anticipation of the next family crisis, had vanished. The silence they left behind was beautiful. Sitting in my corner office, looking out over the sprawling city, my mind drifted back to the afternoon this entire ordeal began. I thought about the vaulted ceilings of the funeral home, the scent of lilies, and the heavy oak doors closing behind the retreating police officers. I remembered the exact pitch of Harper's voice when she pointed at me and screamed for security. "Remove her," Harper had yelled, her face pale with panic. "She is not family." At the time, the words were designed to inflict maximum public humiliation. She wanted to shrink me into submission, to cast me out of the inner circle while her investors watched. But time and distance provide a remarkable clarity. Looking back, I realized the profound irony of her command. When my sister ordered my removal, she was not banishing me from my inheritance. She was inadvertently setting me free. She was removing me from decades of manufactured dysfunction. She was drawing the exact line in the sand that I needed to step over to claim my independence. By declaring I was not family, she severed the final thread of obligation tying me to their toxic stage play. Her attempt to destroy my presence at the funeral became the catalyst for my liberation. The envelope Gregory Sterling carried down the aisle was the legal mechanism of my freedom, but Harper provided the emotional exit. I want to speak directly to the women listening to this story. I want to speak to the daughters who were cast aside because they refused to conform to a damaging narrative. I want to speak to the sisters who worked twice as hard just to be treated with half the respect. If you grew up as the scapegoat in your household, you know the heavy burden of assumed responsibility. You are conditioned to absorb the blame, to fix the crises, and to stay quiet while the favored child takes the credit. You are taught that your strength makes you difficult, while their fragility makes them worthy of protection. Do not let them turn your competence into a weapon against you. Your ability to survive without them is not a flaw. It is your greatest asset. True peace does not come from fixing broken people. You cannot audit a ledger that someone else is determined to falsify. You cannot rescue a relative who builds their success on your foundation while denying your contribution. Peace comes from stepping away from the negotiation table. It comes from drawing a hard boundary and reinforcing it with quiet, undeniable proof. You do not need to scream to be heard. You do not need to match their hysterical energy. You just need to gather your receipts, document your truth, and let reality enforce the consequences. Let them call you cold. Let them call you distant. Your peace of mind is worth far more than their comfortable illusions. Protect your energy. Build a life they cannot borrow, manipulate, or steal. And when they finally demand that you return to your old role, you look them in the eyes and hand them the final balance sheet. Thank you for spending your time with me and listening to this journey. If this story resonated with you, if you recognized a piece of your own struggle in these words, please interact with this channel. Hit the like button and subscribe to QT Told Stories so these narratives can reach the people who need to hear them most. I want to hear from you now. Drop a comment below and share your own experiences. Tell me about the moment you finally set a boundary with a toxic relative. Tell me about the day you stopped trying to fix the unfixable and decided to protect your own peace. Your stories matter, and your courage might be the exact inspiration someone else needs to read today. Until next time, stay focused, guard your boundaries, and never apologize for the strength it took to save yourself.